"Get that military dog out of my restaurant now, or I'm calling the police." The words hung in the air, like smoke from a battlefield, as customers turned to stare at the weathered soldier and his loyal companion. Little did anyone know that what happened next would change an entire community's perspective on sacrifice, loyalty, and what it truly means to serve. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Get that military dog out of my restaurant now, or I'm calling the police. The demand sliced through the ambient chatter of the Sunrise Diner, silencing conversations mid-sentence and drawing all eyes to the confrontation unfolding by the entrance. Standing just inside the door was Master Sergeant James Harrington, his posture military straight despite the subtle tremor in his left hand and the slight favor he gave his right leg. Beside him, perfectly still and alert, sat Ajax, a Belgian Malinois with intelligent amber eyes and a greying muzzle that matched the silver streaks in Harrington's close-cropped hair. The lunch crowd at the Sunrise Diner, a fixture in the small town of Riverdale for over 40 years, collectively held their breath. The restaurant's new owner, Vincent Parker, stood with arms folded across his chest, his expensive watch catching the light as he tapped his finger impatiently against his forearm. At 35, Parker had purchased the diner 6 months ago, the latest addition to his growing collection of local businesses being revitalized with modern aesthetics and standardized policies. "Sir," Harrington spoke with the measured control of someone accustomed to maintaining composure under pressure, "Ajax is a certified service animal under federal law." "I don't care what piece of paper you've got," Parker interrupted, his voice carrying deliberately to ensure the entire diner heard his authority being exercised. "My establishment, my rules, health codes exist for a reason, and I won't have some dog shedding all over my restaurant. There are families with children here." Harrington's weathered face remained impassive, but those closest could see the muscle tightening along his jaw. At 56, he had faced insurgents in Baghdad, survived an IED explosion in Kandahar, and led extraction teams into territories where diplomacy had failed. Yet here, in his hometown diner, where he'd been coming every Thursday for the past 3 years, he suddenly found himself treated as an unwelcome intruder. Ajax, sensing the subtle change in his handler's breathing, pressed closer to Harrington's leg, a trained response to the early indicators of post-traumatic stress. The dog's attention never wavered from Harrington's face, his body perfectly still, except for that deliberate pressure against the veteran's knee. "Ajax isn't just any dog," Harrington explained, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of steel that had once commanded respect from both allies and adversaries. He served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the 5th Special Forces Group. He saved more lives than most combat medics. From a nearby booth, a woman in designer sunglasses scoffed audibly. "It's still an animal," she commented to her companion, deliberately loud enough to be heard. "People with allergies have rights too, you know." The diner had transformed into a theater of uncomfortable tension. Waitresses hovered uncertainly by the counter, order pads clutched in hesitant hands. The cook peered through the service window, spatula suspended mid-flip. Patrons shifted in their seats, some averting their eyes while others stared openly, smartphones discreetly angling toward the confrontation. Parker took a step closer, lowering his voice in what appeared to be an attempt at reasonable compromise, but was undercut by the condescension in his tone. "Look, I appreciate your service and all that, but rules are rules. Why don't you tie the dog up outside? We can bring your food out to you." Harrington looked down at Ajax, whose attention remained unwavering, the same focused vigilance that had detected improvised explosives and hidden enemies in landscapes where distinction between civilian and combatant blurred dangerously. The same dedication that had pulled Harrington from burning wreckage when an IED had ended his military career and begun his struggle with traumatic brain injury and PTSD. Ajax doesn't eat outside, Harrington stated simply. And neither do Njun. An older waitress named Margaret, who had served Harrington and Ajax their usual Thursday lunch of meatloaf and black coffee for 3 years, stepped forward from behind the counter. "Vincent, this is ridiculous. They've been coming here every week since before you bought the place. There's never been a problem." Parker's expression hardened. "I didn't ask for your input, Margaret, and may I remind you that your employment here is at will." He turned back to Harrington. "Sir, I'm going to have to insist." The small-town police officer who had been eating his lunch at the counter now approached, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but feeling obligated to intervene. Officer Dave Reynolds had known Harrington since high school. They'd played football together before taking different paths after graduation, one to the military and one to the local police academy. "Jim," Reynolds said quietly, "maybe today isn't the day for this battle, huh? I could give you a ride home." Harrington's gaze shifted to his old teammate, and something passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that this wasn't about a meal or even a dog, but about dignity being eroded by inches, about the gradual surrender of hard-won territory. "Dave," Harrington replied, his voice firm but not unkind, "this dog has stood between me and enemy fire. He's walked through villages where we couldn't tell friend from foe, and he never once faltered. I won't leave him tied to a post like an afterthought." The diner had fallen completely silent, the only sounds coming from the kitchen where the grill sizzled unattended. In that weighted moment, the division in the room became palpable. Those who saw only rules being enforced and those who recognized something deeper at stake. Parker glanced around, aware that the confrontation had become a public spectacle, and clearly determined to maintain his position of authority. "Officer, if he refuses to leave, I'd like to report a trespasser." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, caught between professional obligation and personal loyalty. "Vincent, let's not escalate this unnecessarily." "It's all right, Dave," Harrington interrupted, his dignity intact despite the public humiliation. With deliberate calm, he turned and headed toward the door, Ajax moving in perfect synchronization. Beside him, before exiting, Harrington paused, turning to face the room one last time. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet resignation that somehow carried more weight than any outburst could have. "This dog has a purple heart," he said simply. "Something to think about while you enjoy your lunch." The door closed behind them with a gentle chime that seemed to release the collective tension in the room. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, plates clattered with artificial normality, but something had shifted in the atmosphere of the Sunrise Diner, a discomfort that couldn't be easily dismissed. Outside, the May sunshine felt incongruously bright after the tense dimness of the diner. Harrington stood for a moment on the sidewalk, his hand resting lightly on Ajax's head, both of them extraordinarily still as they recalibrated to this unexpected rejection. A group of teenagers passed by, one of them filming with his phone. "Dude, check it. Old guy got kicked out with his emotional support pet," he narrated with exaggerated drama. "Probably gonna claim PTSD from the lunch menu." His friends laughed, continuing down the street unaware of how accurately their mockery had identified the very real condition that Ajax helped Harrington manage daily. Harrington didn't acknowledge them, having faced worse than teenage ignorance in Fallujah. Instead, he surveyed Main Street with the habitual situational awareness that never quite leaves a soldier, noting exit routes, evaluating sight lines, identifying potential cover. Old habits embedded through multiple deployments, now applied to the hometown he barely recognized after 15 years of service. Across the street, the town park offered quiet sanctuary with its shaded benches and distant view of the river. Harrington and Ajax made their way there, navigating the crosswalk, with the synchronized movements of two beings long accustomed to moving as one unit. Settling on a bench beneath an old oak tree, Harrington removed a paper-wrapped sandwich from his jacket pocket, a habit developed in zones where the next meal was never guaranteed. He unwrapped it carefully, breaking it in half and offering a portion to Ajax, who accepted it with military discipline, waiting for Harrington's quiet go-ahead before eating. "Not what I promised you for lunch, is it?" Harrington murmured, watching as Ajax ate with methodical precision. "But we've had worse rations, haven't we?" As Ajax finished his portion, Harrington reached into his wallet and removed a worn photograph, its edges softened by years of handling. It showed a younger version of himself, bloodied and dust-covered on a stretcher, with Ajax standing guard beside him, the dog's fur matted with what might have been his handler's blood. The Kandahar Mountains loomed in the background, stark and unforgiving. The photograph bore no caption, needed none. It was a moment frozen in time, the day an IED had ended Harrington's active duty career and forged an unbreakable bond between handler and military working dog. The day Ajax had dragged him from burning wreckage and stood vigil until help arrived, ignoring his own shrapnel wounds. "Some battles choose us, don't they?" Harrington said quietly, speaking to Ajax but also to himself. He tucked the photograph away, his gaze drifting to the diner across the street where life continued behind the large windows, the small drama of his ejection already fading into the routine of the day. From his vantage point, Harrington could observe without being observed, a tactical advantage instinctively sought. He watched as Parker moved between tables, all smiles and hospitality now that the disruption had been removed. He saw Margaret filling coffee cups with mechanical efficiency, her earlier defense apparently forgiven but not forgotten based on the stiffness in her movements. A young mother hurried past their bench, pulling her curious child closer and whispering, something that made the little boy stare at Ajax with wide, apprehensive eyes. Harrington had grown accustomed to being treated as something between curiosity and threat, his military bearing and Ajax's presence marking them as different in ways civilians couldn't quite categorize. As the afternoon progressed, Harrington remained on the bench, partly from stubborn principle and partly because he was waiting for the right time to administer Ajax's medication, anti-inflammatories for the arthritis that had developed in the same hip injured during their last deployment. Soldier and dog, both carrying permanent souvenirs from the same explosive device. A city bus rumbled past, bearing an advertisement featuring a waving American flag and the slogan, "Support our troops, they fight for your freedom." The irony wasn't lost on Harrington, who had returned from his final deployment to find that many of the freedoms he had defended existed in increasingly narrow spaces, defined by policies and liabilities rather than principles. Ajax's head lifted suddenly, his attention focused across the street. Following the dog's gaze, Harrington observed Officer Reynolds exiting the diner, his lunch apparently finished. The officer paused on the sidewalk, scanning the park until he spotted Harrington and Ajax. After a moment's hesitation, he crossed the street and approached their bench. "Got a minute, Jim?" Reynolds asked, removing his cap in a gesture that seemed unconsciously respectful. Harrington gestured to the empty space beside him, all the time in the world, apparently. Reynolds sat, leaning forward with elbows on knees, his cap turning slowly in his hands. That situation in there, it wasn't right. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Most situations aren't," Harrington replied without rancor. "You were doing your job." "That's just it," Reynolds said, genuine conflict evident in his expression. "Sometimes the job and what's right don't line up as neatly as they should." He glanced at Ajax, who was watching him with calm assessment. "I looked up the service animal laws after you left. Parker was wrong, both legally and morally." Harrington nodded, unsurprised. And yet here we sit. Reynolds sighed, replacing his cap with decision. Look, I can go back in there, explain the law to him, make this right. And tomorrow? Harrington asked. And the day after that? How many battles are you prepared to fight for someone else's? Dignity, Dave? Because believe me, they don't end. The question hung between them, bridging the gap between their different experiences of service, one overseas in declared war zones, the other at home in the quieter conflicts of community. Policing. I remember when you shipped out after graduation, Reynolds said finally. Everyone said you were crazy to enlist during wartime, but you said someone had to stand on the wall. Someone always does, Harrington agreed. The question is whether anyone remembers why the wall matters once they're safe behind it. Their conversation was interrupted by the distinctive sound of motorcycles approaching, not the recreational weekend riders that sometimes pass through town, but the deeper, more disciplined rumble of riders who moved in formation. Both men turned toward the sound, Reynolds with professional curiosity and Harrington with the instant threat assessment ingrained through multiple combat deployments. 5 motorcycles appeared at the end of Main Street, their riders uniformed in leather, vests bearing military insignia. They moved as a unit, maintaining perfect spacing as they approached the Sunrise Diner and parked in a synchronized line, their engines falling silent simultaneously. The lead rider removed his helmet, revealing a man in his early 40s with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command. As the other riders dismounted, a pattern emerged. All of them carried themselves with military precision, their movements economical and coordinated even in civilian settings. "Ghosts from your past?" Reynolds asked, noting Harrington's focused attention. "Not mine," Harrington replied, watching as the group entered the diner with purposeful steps. "But I recognize the unit patches. Special Forces, 5th Group." Across the street, the atmosphere in the Sunrise Diner visibly shifted as the 5 men entered. Even through the windows, Harrington could see conversations pausing, heads turning, the natural curiosity that follows when uniformity enters random space. "Should we be concerned?" Reynolds asked, his hand unconsciously moving closer to his service weapon. Harrington shook his head, the ghost of a smile touching his lips for the first time that day. "Not us, no." Both men watched in silence as the inevitable confrontation unfolded inside the diner, visible through the large front windows like a silent film. The lead motorcyclist approached the counter where Parker stood, his stance authoritative but not aggressive. Words were exchanged, Parker's expression transforming from hospitality to confusion to defensive indignation. One of the other men held up a phone, apparently showing Parker something on the screen. The restaurant owner's posture stiffened, his head shaking in what appeared to be denial or justification. The lead motorcyclist placed something on the counter, a card or photograph, then turned to address the entire diner, his voice inaudible from the park, but his presence commanding. Enough that every face turned toward him. "What do you think that's about?" Reynolds asked, though the parallels were becoming obvious. "Justice has many forms," Harrington replied simply, watching as the scene continued to unfold. Inside the diner, several patrons were now standing, some with phones raised, others with expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. The woman who had complained about allergies earlier was noticeably gathering her belongings, her companion leaning close to whisper something urgent. After what appeared to be a brief but impactful speech, the lead motorcyclist collected whatever he had placed on the counter. The 5 men then turned in unison and exited the diner with the same coordinated precision with which they had entered, leaving behind a palpably changed atmosphere. "You knew this would happen," Reynolds stated, not a question, but a realization. Harrington stroked Ajax's head gently. "I knew word would spread. The military community looks after its own, human and canine alike." Across the street, the motorcyclists remounted their bikes, but didn't immediately start their engines. Instead, the lead rider looked directly toward the park bench where Harrington and Ajax sat. Even at this distance, the recognition was clear. One soldier acknowledging another across the divide of civilians between them. The rider raised his hand in a subtle salute. Harrington returned the gesture with equal restraint. No words needed, no explanation required. The language of service transcended the physical space between them. As the motorcycles roared to life and departed with the same disciplined formation in which they had arrived, Reynolds turned to Harrington with newfound understanding. Those weren't random veterans, were they? Ajax served with the 5th Special Forces Group, Harrington explained, his hand still resting on the dog's head. His handler before me was killed in action. The unit never forgot either of them. Reynolds processed this information, connecting the dots between the worn photograph, Ajax's military bearing, and the precisely orchestrated intervention they had just witnessed. So when you said Ajax saved more lives than most combat medics, I wasn't exaggerating, Harrington finished. He has 2 bronze stars and a Purple Heart. More importantly, he has the respect of men who understand the true meaning of service. Across the street, the door of the Sunrise Diner opened, and Margaret emerged, her waitress apron still tied around her waist. She looked around uncertainly before spotting Harrington and Ajax in the park. After a moment's hesitation, she crossed the street carrying a small paper bag. "James!" she called as she approached, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and determination. "I brought you some meatloaf, and something for Ajax too." She held out the bag, a peace offering from one who had spoken up but not loudly enough. Harrington accepted it with grace. "Thank you, Margaret." She twisted her hands in her apron, clearly wanting to say more, but struggling to find the right words. Those men who came in, they told everyone about Ajax, about what he did in Afghanistan. They showed videos. Her voice lowered. They said he saved an entire unit from an ambush, that he's a hero by any definition. "He did his job," Harrington replied simply. "We all did." Margaret nodded, understanding that in those few words lay an entire philosophy, duty fulfilled without expectation of recognition or gratitude. "Vincent's pretty shaken up," she added. "Turns out one of those men is the brother of Congressman Davis. He said something about an investigation into discriminatory business practices." Reynolds couldn't suppress a short laugh. "Consequences tend to find those who forget that freedom comes with responsibilities." Margaret smiled briefly before growing serious again. "James, there's something else you should know. That group of teenagers who were filming earlier, they posted the video online. It's going viral, in a bad way for the diner. People are calling for boycotts." Harrington absorbed this information without visible reaction. The digital battlefield was not one he had ever willingly entered, but he understood its power in modern conflicts. "The diner has been here for 40 years, he said finally. "It shouldn't fall because one owner made a poor decision." "What are you saying?" Margaret asked, confusion evident. "I'm saying that tomorrow is Thursday," Harrington replied, rising from the bench, with Ajax immediately at attention beside him. "And on Thursdays, Ajax and I have meatloaf at the Sunrise Diner." Reynolds stood as well, recognition dawning in his expression. "You're going back? After today?" "Wars aren't won by retreating from contested ground," Harrington said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once led men through hostile territories. "They're won by holding position until understanding can replace fear." As the three stood in the lengthening shadows of the park, the implications of Harrington's decision rippled between them, a choice to transform conflict into opportunity, to answer rejection with presence rather than absence. It was the same steady resolve that had guided him through 3 combat tours, the same unshakable loyalty that had brought Ajax back to his side after their shared brush with mortality. Across the street, Parker could be seen through the diner window, phone pressed to his ear. his earlier confidence replaced by the harried expression of someone watching carefully constructed plans unravel. The normal rhythm of the restaurant had been disrupted, tables empty that had been full before, staff huddled in concerned conversation. "Sometimes," Harrington observed, watching the scene with the detached assessment of someone who had witnessed greater chaos, "people need to be reminded that community isn't built on rules and regulations. It's built on recognizing each other's humanity, and sometimes that humanity walks on four legs." As the sun began its descent behind the buildings of Main Street, casting long shadows across the town square, Harrington gave a subtle hand signal. Ajax rose smoothly, positioning himself at his handler's left side with the precision that came from years of partnership. Together, man and dog moved toward home, their synchronized steps a testament to a bond forged in circumstances most civilians could never comprehend. Behind them, Reynolds and Margaret watched their departure, witnessing without fully understanding the weight of unity that allowed wounded warriors, both human and canine, to continue their mission long after the official battles had ended. And in their wake, like a current shifting beneath still waters, something in the small town of Riverdale had permanently changed. A reminder that true service creates obligation not just from those who receive it, but from those who witness it as well. Dawn broke over the small ranch house on the outskirts of Riverdale, painting the sky in brushstrokes of amber and gold. Inside, Master Sergeant James Harrington had already been awake for 2 hours, a habit formed through decades of military discipline that civilian life had failed to break. The digital clock on his nightstand read 5:45 a.m., 15 minutes before his alarm was set to trigger, though he rarely needed it. The modest 3-bedroom home sat on 2 acres of land, far enough from neighbors to provide the buffer of space and silence that Harrington had come to require since returning from his final deployment. The property wasn't fancy, a simple single-story structure with weathered wooden siding and a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. But it was meticulously maintained, the military precision evident in the perfectly trimmed lawn and methodically organized workshop. Harrington moved through his morning routine with practiced efficiency, 20 minutes of physical therapy exercises to address the lingering damage to his right leg, followed by a shower calibrated to exactly 4 minutes. As he dressed in pressed khaki pants and a simple blue button-up shirt, his movements reflected the unconscious economy of someone who had learned that in certain situations, seconds of hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. In the kitchen, he prepared 2 breakfasts with equal care, scrambled eggs with toast for himself and a precisely measured portion of specialized kibble mixed with fresh chicken for Ajax. The Belgian Malinois watched from his position near the door, his amber eyes tracking Harrington's movements with the focused attention that had once scanned desert landscapes for hidden threats. "Morning report, Ajax," Harrington said, as he placed the dog's bowl on its designated mat. "This daily briefing," speaking, his thoughts aloud to Ajax, had begun as a therapeutic technique suggested by his VA counselor for managing PTSD, but had evolved into a comfortable ritual for both of them. Ajax's perked ears and attentive gaze provided the ideal audience, understanding without judgment, present without expectation. "Schedule shows clear conditions for the morning. Physical therapy for you at 0900 with Dr. Carter for that hip. Perimeter maintenance in the afternoon. Standard Thursday protocol with lunch at the diner at 1300 hours. Harrington paused in his recitation, glancing at the calendar hanging beside the refrigerator where "Diner, 1 p.m." was written in precise block letters, though we might need to reconnoiter the situation after yesterday's encounter. Ajax responded with a single thump of his tail against the floor, acknowledgement received. The communication between them had evolved beyond standard handler commands into something more intuitive, a language developed through shared trauma and recovery that required few words and relied heavily on mutual awareness. As they ate breakfast in companionable silence, early sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, illuminating the collection of photographs arranged on the wall. Unlike many veterans' homes, there were no shadow boxes of medals or prominently displayed uniforms. Instead, the photos told the story of Harrington's 15 years of service through images of the people who had shared it. His unit members gathered around a makeshift Christmas tree in Baghdad, Harrington and 3 other soldiers playing cards. On an aircraft carrier deck, a younger Harrington kneeling beside Ajax after their first successful mission together, both of them dust-covered but intact. Only one military decoration was visible in the entire house, a framed Purple Heart medal positioned beside a photograph of a young soldier with Ajax. The name beneath it read, Specialist Michael Torres, K9 Handler, 5th Special Forces Group. Ajax's first partner, killed by the same explosive device that had wounded the dog. Harrington had inherited both Ajax and the responsibility to honor Torres's memory when he'd been assigned as the dog's new handler for their final deployment. The tradition of morning coffee on the back porch provided Harrington with daily reconnaissance of his small corner of the world. From the weathered Adirondack chair, positioned to provide clear sight lines to both the approach road and the tree line behind the property, he surveyed his domain while Ajax patrolled the perimeter. This ritual provided more than security. It offered the reassuring validation that some territories could still be definitively secured, some boundaries maintained. Today, the routine was interrupted by the sound of approaching tires on gravel. Ajax alerted first, his posture shifting from casual patrol to focused assessment. Moments later, Harrington heard the vehicle, a truck based on the engine sound, turning into his long driveway. "Identify," Harrington said quietly, the command unnecessary but instinctive. Ajax moved to the corner of the porch, position optimized for both observation and protection. After 15 seconds, the dog's posture relaxed slightly, a known entity approaching. The pickup truck that emerged from the stand of pines bordering the drive belonged to Sam Wilson, Harrington's closest neighbor and one of the few civilians who had bridged the often insurmountable gap between military and civilian understanding. At 68, Wilson was a Vietnam veteran who had returned to Riverdale decades earlier and established a successful construction business built largely through hiring fellow veterans. "Little early for a social call, Sam," Harrington commented as Wilson climbed out of his truck. Despite the mild challenge in his words, there was warmth in his tone. Wilson was one of the few people allowed unannounced onto Harrington's property, a privilege extended only to those who understood certain boundaries without requiring explanation. "Early bird gets the coffee before you drink it all," Wilson replied, ascending the porch steps with the slight hitch that betrayed his own war souvenir, shrapnel from a Viet Cong booby trap that had left him with a permanent limp decades before. He extended his hand first to Harrington and then, with equal respect, to Ajax, who accepted the greeting with dignified restraint. "Saw Dave Reynolds at the hardware store this morning," Wilson continued, settling into the second Adirondack chair and accepting the mug of coffee Harrington poured from the thermos. "He mentioned there was some trouble at the diner yesterday." Harrington's expression remained neutral. "News travels fast in small places, especially when it involves the few people in town worth talking about," Wilson agreed. "So what's the situation assessment? That new owner still breathing?" The question drew a rare smile from Harrington. "Situation contained. No casualties." Wilson nodded, understanding that Harrington's economy of words wasn't reticence but precision, communication stripped to essential data, a habit formed when radio transmissions could reveal positions to enemy listeners. "Reynolds said some Special Forces boys showed up after you left, made quite an impression on the lunch crowd." Former unit connections, Harrington confirmed. Nothing coordinated. Uh-huh. Wilson's skeptical tone made it clear he recognized tactical deflection when he heard it. And I suppose it's just coincidence that Captain Marcus Reed from the 5th Group happens to be in town visiting his brother-in-law. Harrington raised an eyebrow. The military world is smaller than civilians. Realize. And the veterans' grapevine moves faster than any intelligence network I've ever seen, Wilson countered, taking a long sip of his coffee before continuing. So, what's the forward strategy? Reynolds seemed to think you're planning to return to the scene of the crime today. Tactical withdrawal only reinforces incorrect assumptions. Wilson chuckled at the military phrasing. In civilian speak, you're going back to teach that young businessman a lesson about respect. Harrington shook his head slightly. Not about teaching, about remembering. The distinction hung between them, meaningful in ways that wouldn't translate to those who hadn't experienced the peculiar brotherhood formed through shared service, the understanding that certain principles, once learned through blood and sacrifice, shouldn't require repeated justification in civilian contexts. Well, I didn't drive out here at dawn just for your mediocre coffee, Wilson said after a moment, reaching into his jacket pocket and removing a small velvet pouch. Thought Ajax might need this for his return mission. He handed the pouch to Harrington, who opened it carefully to reveal a small metal tag designed to attach to a service dog's vest. Engraved on it was Ajax's name, rank, and military decorations, along with the 5th Special Forces Group insignia. Had my nephew make it at his engraving shop, Wilson explained. Thought it might help civilians understand they're not dealing with just any dog. Harrington examined the tag with the careful attention he gave to all equipment, appreciating both the tactical advantage it offered and the sentiment behind it. That's good work, Sam. Thank you. Consider it community reinforcement, Wilson replied with a shrug that belied the thoughtfulness of the gesture. Sometimes people need visual aids to recognize what's standing right in front of them. As they finished their coffee, the conversation shifted to more routine matters. Wilson's new construction project breaking ground on the other side of a town. The condition of the access road they shared after recent rains, the progress of Harrington's vegetable garden. The ordinary exchanges of neighbors anywhere, underscored by the mutual understanding that normalcy itself was a hard-won privilege. When Wilson departed an hour later, Harrington returned to his morning routine, reviewing the day's objectives, checking Ajax's equipment, and mentally preparing for their appointments. The visit had provided more than just a tangible token of support. It had reinforced that, even in civilian territory, certain alliances remained operational. At precisely 8:45 a.m., Harrington and Ajax loaded into Harrington's dark blue Ford F-150, a vehicle chosen for its reliability, maintenance simplicity, and clearance height that accommodated his damaged leg without obvious assistance. The drive to the veterinary clinic took exactly 12 minutes under normal conditions, and Harrington believed in allowing a 3-minute buffer for variables. Tardiness was a luxury afforded to those who had never needed to synchronize watches. Before entering hostile territory, Riverdale veterinary specialists occupied a modern single-story building on the edge of town, its design reflecting its founders' understanding of their clientele. Dr. Eliza Carter had established the practice after returning from 4 years as a military veterinarian with deployments to both Iraq and Afghanistan. Her clinic featured wide hallways for service dogs working with mobility-impaired handlers, separate entrances for animals that might trigger each other's training responses, and staff trained to recognize and accommodate the unique needs of working animals and their veteran handlers. "Right on time, Master Sergeant," Dr. Carter greeted them in the parking lot, her professional white coat covered with a light dusting of fur. At 38, she carried herself with the confident efficiency of someone accustomed to managing medical emergencies in less than ideal conditions. "How's our favorite patient doing today?" "Maintaining operational status," Harrington replied, the formal phrasing softened by the genuine respect in his tone. Hip stiffness increases after prolonged stationary positions. Dr. Carter nodded, immediately translating military speak into veterinary assessment as she led them through a side entrance that bypassed the main waiting room. "That's consistent with the arthritis progression we've been monitoring. Has he been reluctant to perform any specific movements or tasks?" "Negative. Full compliance with all protocols. Performance metrics stable." They entered an examination room designed specifically for service dogs, larger than standard, with specialized equipment that allowed for treatment while maintaining the animal's dignity and working mindset. Unlike pet owners, service dog handlers couldn't simply transfer control to the veterinarian. The unbreakable bond between handler and dog needed to be respected and incorporated into all medical interactions. "Let's take a look at that hip." "Ajax," Dr. Carter said, addressing the dog directly as she always did with her working animal patients. "Master Sergeant, if you could have him demonstrate a standard perimeter sweep, I'd like to observe his gait under command conditions." The examination proceeded with the same methodical thoroughness that characterized all interactions between veterans who recognized each other's professionalism. Dr. Carter's assessment combined traditional veterinary medicine with her specialized knowledge of how working dogs functioned under field conditions. Her questions were precise, her handling of Ajax respectful of both his training and his bond with Harrington. "The arthritis is progressing about as expected," she concluded, after completing a series of range-of-motion tests and reviewing the previous X-rays displayed on a wall-mounted screen. "The good news is that the surgical repair from his combat injury remains stable. The challenge now is managing his comfort while maintaining his ability to perform his service duties." Harrington nodded, absorbing the information with the focused attention he gave all mission-critical data. "Recommendations? I'd like to adjust his anti-inflammatory medication. Same type, but increased dosage. We'll also add a joint supplement that's showing promising results in military working dogs with similar profiles." She made notes in Ajax's file while continuing. "Physical therapy should continue, but let's modify the underwater treadmill protocol to reduce impact while maintaining muscle tone." As Dr. Carter prepared the new prescriptions and demonstrated the modified exercises, her professional demeanor briefly softened. "I heard about what happened at the diner yesterday," she said. Her voice lowered, although they were alone in the examination room. "Word travels fast in the veteran community." Harrington's expression remained neutral. "Standard civilian misunderstanding of operational parameters. There's nothing standard about disrespecting a decorated K-9 veteran." Dr. Carter countered, her own military background evident in the flash of indignation, especially one with Ajax's service record. "Civilians operate with limited intelligence on military matters," Harrington replied, neither excusing nor condemning the behavior. "Ajax and I have encountered more hostile environments." Dr. Carter's smile held a hint of the dark humor common among those who had served in combat zones. "Yes, but in those environments you were authorized to respond with appropriate force." The observation drew a rare chuckle from Harrington. Different rules of engagement on home soil. "Speaking of engagement," Dr. Carter continued as she finished entering notes into Ajax's electronic file, "Captain Reed stopped by this morning to check on his sister's search and rescue shepherd. Mentioned he and some of the 5th Group veterans might be at the diner around lunchtime today. Pure coincidence, I'm sure." "Of course," Harrington agreed, the ghost of a smile touching his eyes, if not his lips. "Riverdale is a small town." with a surprisingly high concentration of special operations veterans for its size, Dr. Carter added, handing him Ajax's medications along with printed instructions. Almost like someone's been quietly recruiting. The observation wasn't far from truth. Over the past 3 years, Harrington had indeed helped several former military colleagues transition to civilian life in Riverdale, not through any formal program, but through the same methodical network building that had once helped him identify local allies in foreign territories. Small towns offered certain tactical advantages for veterans struggling with reintegration: lower costs of living, reduced population density, and significant distance from the triggering stimuli of urban environments. As they prepared to leave the clinic, Dr. Carter's professional demeanor returned. "I'd like to see Ajax again in 2 weeks to evaluate his response to the new medication protocol. And Master Sergeant," her voice took on the crisp tone of a military briefing, "as his doctor, I'm instructing you both to maintain your regular routines. Disruptions to established patterns can increase stress levels in service animals and their handlers." Harrington recognized the medical advice for what it also was: strategic reinforcement of his decision to return to the diner despite yesterday's confrontation. "Understood, Doctor. We'll maintain standard operational parameters." The exchange between them represented more than veterinary consultation. It was the quiet solidarity of those who shared an understanding that civilian life required its own form of courage, the determination to establish and defend territory not with weapons, but with presence, persistence, and the refusal to surrender. Hard-won ground. As they left the clinic, Harrington checked his watch. 10:45 a.m., leaving 2 hours and 15 minutes before their regular Thursday lunch appointment at the Sunrise Diner. Time enough to complete their next objective: the weekly visit to Riverdale Elementary School. The school visits had begun a year earlier, part of a veteran outreach program organized by Riverdale's former mayor, a Gulf War veteran himself. What had started as a one-time presentation about military working dogs for a 4th grade class had evolved into a regular Thursday morning tradition. The educational value extended beyond simple demonstrations of Ajax's training. It created a bridge between military experience and civilian understanding, translated into terms elementary school students could grasp. Principal Diane Morgan greeted them at the school's side entrance, another accommodation for Ajax's training, allowing them to bypass the chaotic main hallway during class transitions. "They're all ready for you, Master Sergeant," she said, leading them toward the library where 2 combined 5th grade classes waited. They've been talking about nothing else all week. The school visits required Harrington to step outside his natural reticence, to translate his experiences into language children could understand without distorting the underlying truths. It had been uncomfortable at first, this public speaking, role so different from the clear command structure of military communication. But he had approached it like any unfamiliar territory, with reconnaissance, strategic planning, and adaptive tactics. "Remember our mission parameters," he said quietly to Ajax as they paused outside the library doors. The dog's posture shifted subtly, still alert but with a slightly softer presentation, a modification to his working stance that they had developed specifically for interacting with children. Even in this, Ajax demonstrated the remarkable adaptability that had made military working dogs invaluable in environments ranging from combat zones to earthquake rubble to elementary school libraries. Inside, 28 students sat cross-legged on a colorful rug, their excited whispers falling immediately silent as Harrington and Ajax entered. Their teacher, Miss Patterson, a young woman whose brother served in the Navy, offered a respectful nod before addressing her class. "As you know, every Thursday we're honored to have Master Sergeant Harrington and Ajax visit us to continue our special project," she reminded them. "Remember our guidelines. Raise hands for questions. No sudden..." movements and absolute quiet during demonstrations. Harrington moved to the front of the room, with Ajax perfectly positioned at his left side, both of them at ease in a presentation they had delivered many times before. Yet Harrington never allowed the routine to become perfunctory. Each session was approached with the same focused intention as a mission briefing, recognizing that the students before him represented the future civilian understanding of military service and sacrifice. "Good morning," he began, his deep voice carrying authority without intimidation. "Today, we'll continue our discussion of how working dogs like Ajax communicate with their handlers in different environments." The presentation unfolded with the same careful structure that characterized all of Harrington's operations: clear objectives, demonstrated examples, and opportunity for supervised interaction. He showed the students how Ajax responded to hand signals, how different postures communicated different information, how the bond between handler and dog created a system of communication that transcended ordinary training. "Ajax doesn't just obey commands," Harrington explained, as the dog demonstrated a perfect perimeter check of the library at his subtle hand signal. "He thinks, assesses, and makes decisions based on his training and our partnership. In Afghanistan, this kind of teamwork saved lives." A small boy in the front row raised his hand, waiting to be acknowledged before asking, "Did Ajax ever get scared during the war?" The question represented the beautiful directness of children, cutting through layers of protocol to the human and canine experience beneath. Harrington considered his answer carefully, balancing honesty with age-appropriate context. "Fear is a natural response to dangerous situations," he replied, kneeling to reduce the height difference between himself and the students, despite the twinge in his damaged leg. "What makes Ajax exceptional isn't a lack of fear, but his willingness to do his job despite it. True courage isn't about not feeling afraid. It's about doing what's necessary even when you are afraid." Another hand shot up, a girl with braided hair and serious eyes. "Is that why Ajax stays with you now? Because you both were soldiers together?" The question touched on deeper territory than the usual inquiries about what Ajax ate or how fast he could run. Harrington met the girl's gaze directly, respecting the intelligence behind her curiosity. "Ajax and I serve together differently now," he explained, resting his hand lightly on the dog's head. "He helps me navigate challenges here at home, just as we once helped each other navigate dangerous territory overseas. That's what partnership means, supporting each other across different landscapes." The simplified explanation couldn't possibly encompass the full complexity of their bond. How Ajax's presence mitigated the hyper-vigilance and sensory processing issues that accompanied Harrington's traumatic brain injury. How the dog's trained responses to subtle physiological changes helped interrupt post-traumatic stress episodes before they escalated. How their shared experiences created a foundation of understanding that no civilian relationship could replicate. As the session continued, Harrington noticed a boy at the back of the group, new since their last visit, sitting slightly apart from the others, with the cautious isolation of someone accustomed to being an outsider. When demonstration time came, for students to practice the simple hand signals Harrington had taught them in previous sessions, this boy remained in his spot, watching but not participating. With the subtle situational awareness that had once helped him identify both threats and allies in foreign marketplaces, Harrington assessed the dynamics at play, the boy's body language suggesting not disinterest but uncertainty, perhaps fear disguised as indifference. A familiar pattern Harrington had observed in new recruits, in recently transferred unit members, in himself during his earliest days of civilian reintegration. While the other students practiced in small groups under Ms. Patterson's supervision, Harrington approached the boy, Ajax following at perfect heel. First time meeting a military working dog? He asked, his tone matter-of-fact rather than condescending. The boy nodded, his expression guarded. We just moved here last week. From Chicago. Name and rank? Harrington asked, the formality deliberate, treating the boy with the same respect he would show a new team member rather than the artificial enthusiasm adults often inflicted on children. Tyler, the boy replied, straightening slightly at being addressed as an equal, Tyler Reeves. Master Sergeant James Harrington, he responded with a subtle nod. And this is Ajax, formerly of the 5th Special Forces Group, currently serving as my partner in civilian operations. Tyler's eyes widened slightly at the formal introduction. He's really been in actual wars. 3 deployments to Afghanistan. Harrington confirmed. He specialized in explosive detection and personnel security. The boy studied Ajax with new interest, his initial hesitation transforming into something closer to recognition. My dad was in Afghanistan too, he said, quietly. He doesn't talk about it much. The simple statement contained volumes of unspoken context that Harrington immediately understood. The particular silence of combat veterans around their families, the careful boundaries erected to protect loved ones from second-hand trauma, the invisible dividing line between those who had experienced war and those who could only imagine it. Many don't, Harrington acknowledged, neither pressing for details nor dismissing the confidence. It's a different language, sometimes difficult to translate. Tyler's posture had relaxed slightly, the tentative connection of shared understanding, even at one remove, creating a bridge across his isolation. Can I? He hesitated, glancing at Ajax. Is it okay to pet him? Mom says you're not supposed to touch service dogs. Your mother is correct about the general protocol, Harrington confirmed, respecting the boy's question with a full explanation rather than simplified permission. Service dogs working in public shouldn't be distracted by interaction with strangers. However, this is a controlled educational environment, and Ajax has additional training for these situations. He gave Ajax a subtle hand signal, permission for controlled interaction, before addressing Tyler again. Hold your hand out, palm down. Let him approach you first. That's showing respect for his space and decision-making. The care with which Tyler followed these instructions, the serious concentration on his face as he slowly extended his hand, spoke of a child accustomed to navigating careful protocols at home, perhaps around a parent with invisible wounds. Ajax responded to this respectful approach by gently touching his nose to the boy's hand, before allowing himself to be petted. He's softer than he looks, Tyler observed with surprise. Many tough exteriors hide unexpected gentleness, Harrington replied, the observation applicable beyond just the dog. Ajax can detect explosives hidden underground, track missing personnel through mountainous terrain, and apprehend armed threats, but he also knows when someone needs simple companionship. As Tyler cautiously stroked Ajax's head, something in the boy's guarded expression softened. Does he live with you all the time? Affirmative. We're a permanent team now. That's cool, Tyler said simply, but the words carried the weight of genuine appreciation. I wish. He trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. Harrington waited, allowing the silence to provide space for whatever might follow. It was a technique he had learned not in military training, but in his own therapy sessions at the VA, the understanding that some thoughts required patience to fully form. I wish my dad had someone like Ajax, Tyler finally continued, his voice lowered as if sharing a secret. Sometimes he gets really quiet and stares at nothing, or he can't sleep, or loud noises make him jump really bad. Mom says it's just how he is now, that we have to give him space when it happens. The description, delivered with the straightforward, perception of a child painted a painfully familiar picture of post-traumatic stress, one Harrington recognized from both external observation and internal experience. The boy wasn't asking for solutions or even explanation. He was simply giving voice to a reality he lived with daily. "Your father served his country honorably," Harrington said after a moment, choosing his words with careful precision. The things he experienced there changed him, as they change all who serve in combat zones. That doesn't mean he's broken, only that he's carrying experiences most civilians never have to understand. Tyler nodded, a depth of comprehension in his young face that spoke of early maturity born from navigating a household shaped by war's aftermath. "Yeah, that's kind of what Mom says too." Harrington made a decision then, based on the same instinctive assessment of character that had once helped him identify potential allies in villages where trust could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "Tyler, Ajax, and I visit the school every Thursday morning, and afterward we have lunch at the Sunrise Diner in town. Your father would be welcome to join us sometime if he's interested in meeting a fellow Afghanistan veteran." He reached into his pocket and removed one of the simple cards he carried. Not a traditional business card, but a modified military contact card with his name, phone number, and unit affiliation. "No pressure or timeline," Harrington added as he handed the card to Tyler. "Some men take longer to find their way back to connection. Doesn't mean they don't want to find it." The boy accepted the card with careful reverence, as if receiving something far more significant than a small rectangle of cardstock. "I'll tell him. Thank you, sir." "Master Sergeant," Harrington corrected gently. "Thank you, Master Sergeant," Tyler amended with a small smile, the first genuine one Harrington had seen from him. Their conversation was interrupted as Ms. Patterson called the class back together for the final demonstration. Tyler rejoined his classmates with subtly altered body language, shoulders slightly less hunched, head a fraction higher. Small adjustments that might go unnoticed by civilian observers, but registered clearly to Harrington's trained eye as improved operational status. As the presentation concluded and the students filed out with waves and thank yous, Principal Morgan approached with a folder in hand. "Before you go, Master Sergeant, the students completed their letters for the project. Would you be willing to deliver them to the VA hospital next time you visit?" The folder contained handwritten letters from each student to hospitalized veterans, part of the ongoing community connection program that had grown from Harrington's initial school visits. He accepted it with a formal nod, recognizing the assignment for what it was. Not just busy work for students, but a tangible connection between civilians and those who had served. An early introduction to the concept of communal responsibility for returning warriors. "We'll ensure delivery, ma'am," he confirmed, tucking the folder carefully into his jacket. "Standard protocol." As they left the school and returned to the truck, Harrington checked his watch. 12:10 p.m., leaving 45 minutes until their regular lunch appointment at the Sunrise Diner. After yesterday's confrontation, tactical assessment suggested multiple possible approaches to the situation. Strategic withdrawal was one option, finding another establishment for their Thursday routine. Delayed engagement was another, postponing their return until the immediate tension had dissipated. But as he started the truck and glanced at Ajax, sitting attentively in the specially modified passenger seat, Harrington considered the deeper mission parameters at stake. This wasn't simply about a meal, or even about access rights for a service dog. It was about maintaining the hard-won territory of reintegration, about refusing to surrender ground that belonged rightfully to those who had sacrificed to secure it. More importantly, it was about the ripple effects of either retreat or advance. What message each would send to Tyler Reeves and his father, to the students who looked forward to their Thursday visits, to the veterans in Riverdale who watched Harrington's integration into civilian life as a model for their own. "Proceed to primary objective," Harrington said to Ajax as he pulled away from the school parking lot, the decision made not in the heat of the moment, but in the clear-eyed assessment of what the mission truly required. Standard protocols remain in effect. Ajax's posture straightened slightly. The subtle shift from general alert status to mission-specific focus that had once preceded their entry into villages where threat assessment required constant calibration. Man and dog preparing once again to navigate contested territory, not with weapons or tactical gear, but with the quiet determination that had carried them through far more dangerous landscapes than a small-town diner. As they drove toward Main Street, Harrington attached the new identification tag Wilson had provided to Ajax's service vest, not as decoration or even justification, but as clear communication of identity and purpose. In military operations and civilian reintegration alike, clarity of mission parameters often made the difference between unnecessary conflict and successful navigation. The Sunrise Diner came into view as they turned onto Main Street, its large windows reflecting the midday sun. Several motorcycles were parked in front, their military-affiliated decals visible even from a distance. Inside, life appeared to be proceeding with normal lunchtime rhythm, citizens of Riverdale going about their day, unaware that they were about to witness not just a meal being served, but a principle being defended. "Final equipment check," Harrington said as he parked the truck. Ajax sat at attention, service vest secure, new identification tag prominently displayed. "Mission parameters confirmed. Proceed with standard formation on my mark." The command was unnecessary for the highly trained dog, but significant to the handler, a reaffirmation of their partnership, a reminder that even in this civilian landscape, they moved as a unit with purpose and protocol. Some rituals transcended their practical necessity to become affirmations of identity and commitment. As they exited the vehicle and approached the diner entrance, Harrington noted the strategic positioning of the motorcycles, not randomly parked, but arranged to be clearly visible from the diner's windows, their military affiliations prominently displayed. The message was subtle, but clear to anyone who understood the language of presence. Attention and support were being deliberately signaled. With Ajax at perfect heel position, Harrington opened the door to the Sunrise Diner, stepping once again into contested territory, not as an aggressor seeking conflict, but as a warrior who understood that some boundaries must be maintained with unwavering resolve if they are to be respected at all. The moment Master Sergeant James Harrington stepped through the door of the Sunrise Diner with Ajax at his side, the ambient noise level dropped perceptibly. Conversations paused mid-sentence, silverware stilled against plates, and all eyes turned toward the entrance. The tactical assessment was immediate and clear. Word of yesterday's confrontation had spread throughout Riverdale with the efficient speed that small towns reserve for matters of genuine interest. Vincent Parker emerged from the back office, as if summoned by some silent alarm, his expression shifting from businesslike neutrality to visible tension when he spotted Harrington and Ajax. His path toward them was intercepted by Margaret, who murmured something urgent that caused Parker to hesitate, glancing around at the now attentive customers before adjusting his approach. "Master Sergeant," Parker greeted with forced civility, the military title an obvious concession he hadn't offered yesterday. "I believe there was some misunderstanding during your last visit. Perhaps we could discuss this privately." Harrington assessed the tactical situation with the same methodical thoroughness he had once applied to entering contested villages in Helmand province. The diner's usual Thursday lunch crowd was present, but with notable additions, 5 men in leather motorcycle vests bearing military insignia occupied a corner booth, their positions offering clear sightlines to both the entrance and the counter. Captain Marcus Reed among them, his acknowledgement of Harrington limited to a nearly imperceptible nod that would go unnoticed by civilian observers, but conveyed volumes between veterans. Near the window, Officer Dave Reynolds sat with police, Chief Michael Grayson, their uniforms creating an official presence that seemed deliberately conspicuous. 3 booths were occupied by men Harrington recognized from the local VFW post, their average age north of 65, but their military bearing still evident in their posture and situational awareness. This was no random collection of diners. This was a strategic positioning of allies. "No private discussion required," Harrington replied, his voice calm but carrying sufficient volume to be heard by those nearby. "Ajax and I are here for our regular Thursday lunch. Table by the east window, meatloaf special, black coffee, standard operation." Parker's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Master Sergeant, I believe we should clarify the service animal policy before proceeding. My concerns yesterday were primarily about—" "Your concerns were addressed by multiple patrons after our departure," Harrington interrupted with precision rather than rudeness. "I'm not here to negotiate established legal protections or educate on federal accessibility laws. I'm here for lunch." From the corner booth, Captain Reed's voice cut through the tension. "The meatloaf here is highly recommended, Master Sergeant. My team and I found it exceptional." The simple comment carried layered meaning, affirming Harrington's right to be served, establishing the military presence as coordinated rather than coincidental, and offering the diner owner a graceful path toward resolution through normal service rather than continued confrontation. Parker glanced toward the Special Forces veterans, clearly recognizing that this situation had expanded beyond a simple disagreement about restaurant policy. The calculated presence of military, law, enforcement, and veterans created a clear message about community expectations and priorities. "Of course," Parker conceded, though tension remained evident in his posture. "Margaret will show you to your table." As Margaret led them to their regular spot by the east window, Harrington noted the subtle nods of acknowledgement from various patrons. Some veterans he recognized, others civilians who had apparently reassessed their position since yesterday's events. Ajax moved in perfect heel position, his discipline bearing itself a silent refutation of concerns about his presence. "Your usual table," Margaret said as they reached the corner booth, that offered both a clear view of the entrance and a solid wall at Harrington's back, a position he had selected years ago for the tactical advantages it provided for someone whose combat experiences had left him uncomfortable with exposed positions in public spaces. She handed him a menu with unnecessary formality, then leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Half the town's been calling since those Special Forces boys left yesterday. Vincent's been getting an education on service dogs and federal laws from just about everyone with a phone. Mrs. Delaney, you know, the mayor's wife, cancelled the Chamber of Commerce luncheon scheduled here for next week." Harrington accepted this intelligence update with a single nod, understanding its significance beyond the immediate situation. The ripple effects of yesterday's confrontation had expanded into economic and political dimensions, territory that concerned Parker much more directly than abstract principles about respect for veterans. "The usual for both of us," he replied, indicating that despite the circumstances, his purpose was to maintain normal routines rather than escalate conflict. Margaret nodded and moved toward the kitchen, her purposeful stride suggesting determination to ensure this meal proceeded without incident. Across the diner, conversations gradually resumed, though with a heightened awareness that kept returning to Harrington and Ajax like compass needles finding north. Officer Reynolds approached their table, coffee pot in hand, an unusual role for law enforcement but a clear signal of support. "Thought you might appreciate a fresh cup," he said, filling Harrington's mug with deliberate casualness. Quiet morning so far. Chief and I are just having a strategy meeting about community and the policing initiatives. The subtext was clear. Law enforcement was present not as potential peacekeepers, but as community members affirming values through their presence. Reynolds glanced at Ajax, who maintained perfect position beside the booth, alert but relaxed. "That new tag looks official," Reynolds commented, noticing the military identification now attached to Ajax's service vest. "Proper identification prevents unnecessary confusion," Harrington replied. Reynolds nodded, understanding the military principle being applied to this civilian situation. Clear communication of status and function eliminated the need for confrontation or explanation. "Makes sense. Enjoy your lunch, Master Sergeant." "Agree." As Reynolds returned to his table, Harrington observed Parker in conversation with one of the cooks near the kitchen entrance, their body language suggesting disagreement kept barely below the surface. The diner owner's composure showed increasing strain. A businessman discovering that profit margins and corporate policies existed within a more complex ecosystem of community relationships and values. The bell above the door chimed as new customers entered, a middle-aged couple Harrington didn't recognize, likely passing through town. Their casual tourist attire and uncertain scanning of the restaurant marked them as visitors rather than locals. When their gaze fell on Ajax, the wife nudged her husband and whispered something that caused him to nod with apparent approval. Margaret returned with 2 plates, the meatloaf special for Harrington and a carefully prepared portion of plain, cooled hamburger for Ajax, served in a proper dog dish rather than a standard plate. This detail, the appropriate accommodation for a working dog, spoke volumes about the diner's rapid adaptation since yesterday's confrontation. "Chef Mike says it's on the house today," Margaret informed him, setting the plates down with the flourish she reserved for her favorite customers. "Says he's got a nephew in the Marines and wouldn't want him treated the way you were yesterday." Harrington accepted this gesture without comment, but with a respectful nod, acknowledging the sentiment without requiring the apology to be verbalized. In veteran circles, actions carried more weight than words, and the proper service spoke more clearly than any verbal reconciliation could have. As he began his meal, Harrington maintained his habitual situational awareness, noting Parker's continued discomfort as he moved between tables with forced cheerfulness. The diner owner kept glancing toward Harrington's table and then to the Special Forces veterans in the corner, his expression suggesting internal calculation of costs and benefits, reputation and principle. Captain Reed approached after several minutes, his movement toward Harrington's table deliberate but casual, a skilled operator making a planned maneuver appear spontaneous. At 42, Reed carried himself with the controlled precision that marked special operations veterans, alert without being tense, confident without being aggressive. "Mind if I join you for a moment, Master Sergeant?" he asked, though both men knew this conversation had been coordinated well before either had arrived at the diner. Harrington gestured to the empty side of the booth. "At your discretion, Captain." Reed settled across from him, his positioning allowing him to maintain sightlines to both the entrance and his team in the corner booth. "Quite a coincidence. Running into you here," he commented, the irony evident in his tone. "Almost like someone provided actionable intelligence about your Thursday routines." "Small-town operational security has notable vulnerabilities," Harrington replied, the ghost of a smile touching his eyes, if not his mouth. Reed glanced down at Ajax, who maintained his position while occasionally accepting the small pieces of plain hamburger Harrington offered. The controlled feeding demonstrating both the dog's discipline and the handler's appropriate management of a service animal in public. "I hear Ajax has been working with the elementary school," Reed said, transitioning smoothly to establish the broader context of their presence in the community. "My sister's boy came home last month talking about a military dog who could understand hand signals from across the room. made quite an impression. Educational outreach has proven effective for civilian integration, Harrington confirmed. Reed nodded, understanding the multiple layers of that statement, how the school visits served not just to educate children about military working dogs, but to bridge the gap between veteran experience and civilian understanding, creating spaces where the rigid boundaries of us and them began to soften. "The team and I are setting up something similar in Bakersfield," Reed continued, referring to a nearby city where several of his former unit members had settled. Veteran mentorship program focused on teens. Figure if we can adapt to hostile terrain overseas, we can navigate high school culture. Their conversation continued with the efficient exchange of information characteristic of men accustomed to mission briefings, updates on mutual acquaintances, developments in veteran support programs, tactical assessments of integration challenges. To civilian observers, it might have appeared as casual catching up between old colleagues, but beneath the surface ran the structured communication of a community maintaining its internal connections and external boundaries. Throughout their conversation, Harrington noted Parker making repeated passes near their table, each approach abandoned before completion. A man wanting to address a situation, but uncertain how to navigate territory governed by unfamiliar protocols. The diner owner's discomfort was increasingly evident, his earlier confidence replaced by the hesitant recalibration of someone whose assumptions had been fundamentally challenged. The bell above the door chimed again, drawing all eyes to the new arrival. Even Harrington, with his exceptional situational control, couldn't fully mask his surprise at seeing Tyler Reeves enter the diner, accompanied by a tall man whose military bearing was unmistakable despite his civilian clothes. The man's hypervigilant scanning of the room, the careful positioning that kept his back toward the wall, and the subtle favoring of his left side all communicated a familiar story to those trained to read such signs. Tyler spotted Harrington. Immediately, his face lighting with recognition as he tugged his father's sleeve and pointed toward the corner table. After a moment's visible hesitation, the man allowed his son to lead him across the diner, his gait betraying the same slight irregularity that marked many veterans who had encountered improvised explosive devices. "Master Sergeant Harrington," Tyler said as they reached the table, the formal address delivered with solemn precision. "This is my dad. He wanted to meet you and Ajax." Harrington stood immediately, military courtesy embedded too deeply to remain seated when introductions were being made. Captain Reed followed suit, both men extending the respect that transcended rank or branch when meeting a fellow combat veteran. "Staff Sergeant David Reeves, 10th Mountain Division," the man introduced himself, his handshake firm despite the slight tremor Harrington detected. "Tyler insisted we come today, said he met a dog who understood war." The simple statement contained volumes of meaning that civilian ears might miss, but that resonated deeply with the veterans present. Not just a dog who had served in war zones, but one who comprehended, on some essential level, the experience that set combat veterans apart from the civilian world they had returned to. "Ajax has that capacity," Harrington confirmed, gesturing to the empty side of the booth in silent invitation. "We served our final tour together in Kandahar province." Reed excused himself with the subtle efficiency of someone trained to recognize when his presence was no longer mission-critical, returning to his team in the corner booth. As Reeves settled into the booth with Tyler beside him, his body language communicated the familiar tension of a combat veteran in public spaces, the hyper-awareness that civilian environments often intensified rather than relieved. "Tyler says, you visit his school every week," Reeves said, his tone suggesting an effort to engage in normal conversation despite the visible strain it caused him. That's good." Kids should understand what service means before they see it on recruiting posters. The educational foundation improves operational understanding, Harrington agreed, recognizing in Reeves the particular isolation of veterans whose reintegration remained incomplete. The struggle to translate experience into language civilians could comprehend, the exhaustion of constantly navigating between military identity and civilian expectations. As their conversation continued, Harrington noted Ajax's subtle shift in positioning. The dog had moved slightly closer to Reeves, maintaining protocol but adjusting his stance in the almost imperceptible way he did when detecting the physiological markers of post-traumatic stress. It was a response trained through countless hours of specialized work, the ability to recognize the invisible signatures of hidden wounds. Tyler watched this interaction with fascination, his young face showing the keen observation of a child who had learned to read subtle cues out of necessity. "See, Dad?" he said quietly. "Ajax knows." The simple statement carried more weight than its 3 words suggested, an acknowledgement of how children of combat veterans develop their own hypervigilance, their own ability to detect the invisible tremors that preceded storms within their homes. Tyler had recognized in Ajax a reflection of his own adaptive skills, the capacity to sense what remained unspoken. Reeves looked down at the dog, something shifting in his expression as he recognized the non-judgmental awareness in Ajax's steady gaze. "How long did it take?" he asked Harrington, his voice lowered. "After you got back, I mean, to feel, adjusted?" The question cut through the formalities to the heart of what many veterans never discussed openly: the duration and nature of the journey from combat operations to civilian functionality. It wasn't a topic for VFW meetings or VA waiting rooms, too raw and personal for casual disclosure. Yet here, in the unexpected sanctuary created by Ajax's presence and Tyler's unfiltered connection-making, it emerged naturally. "Adjustment isn't a timeline," Harrington answered carefully. "It's a process of mapping new territory with old skills. Some areas integrate faster than others." Reeves nodded, understanding the measured response from a fellow veteran. Neither false reassurance nor discouraging reality, but acknowledgement of a shared journey with variable terrain. "Tyler said you have a group that meets veterans with similar mapping challenges?" "Thursday evenings at the community center," Harrington confirmed. "No uniforms, no paperwork, no official agenda. Just shared space for those navigating similar territory." The conversation continued, shifting between casual exchanges that included Tyler and more loaded communications between the 2 veterans. Information about local resources, tactical approaches to civilian challenges, and the unspoken recognition of shared experience that transcended the differences in their service branches and deployments. Throughout their interaction, Harrington remained aware of the diner's dynamics, how Parker observed their table with increasing frequency, how other patrons occasionally glanced toward them with expressions ranging from curiosity to respect, how the Special Forces team maintained their casual but strategic positioning in the corner booth. The stakes of their presence had evolved beyond the immediate issue of Ajax's access rights. What was unfolding was a more fundamental renegotiation of community values. What would be prioritized? Who would be respected? Which principles would govern public spaces in Riverdale? Yesterday's confrontation had catalyzed a conversation, much larger than one restaurant's policies or one veteran's dignity. After 15 minutes of conversation, Reeves checked his watch with the habitual precision common to those for whom time had once been measured in patrol rotations and mission parameters. "I should get Tyler back for his afternoon classes," he said, though his reluctance was evident in the way he hesitated before sliding out of the booth. "Dad," Tyler said with the directness children often employ when adults hesitate, You should ask him." Reeves shot his son a look that mingled embarrassment and affection before turning back to Harrington. "Tyler's been having some challenges at school, adjustment issues with the move. His counselor suggested a support system might help, an adult he can relate to." He paused, the request clearly difficult for a man accustomed to self-reliance. "Would it be inappropriate if he joined you for those school visits sometimes, to help with Ajax?" The request represented more than a simple mentorship arrangement. It was one veteran acknowledging that he needed assistance, providing his son with support he couldn't fully offer himself, a recognition that the isolation affecting him was creating secondary impacts on his family. "Ajax's operational parameters include training assistance," Harrington replied, the formal phrasing softening what might otherwise be an emotionally complex agreement. "Tyler has already demonstrated appropriate handling protocols. We can coordinate with Principal Morgan for proper authorization." The technical language provided comfortable distance from the emotional significance of the arrangement, a communication style familiar to both men, allowing important connections to form beneath the surface of practical logistics. Tyler's beaming face, however, required no such translation, his excitement transparent and unfiltered. As they prepared to leave, Parker approached their table with the determined stride of someone who had finally made a decision after considerable internal debate. His expression suggested discomfort, but resolution, as he addressed Harrington directly. "Master Sergeant, I owe you an apology," he said, the words emerging with evident effort but apparent sincerity. "I've been educated on service animal regulations and military working dog protocols over the past 24 hours by what seems like half the town. My treatment of you and Ajax yesterday was inappropriate and uninformed." The apology hung in the air, more meaningful for being delivered in front of witnesses, including another veteran and his son. Parker continued before Harrington could respond, reaching into his pocket and removing a laminated card. "I've implemented a new policy," he explained, handing the card to Harrington. It read, "Service Animals Welcome," in bold letters, with additional text outlining proper accommodation. "Procedures. My staff is being trained on appropriate protocols, and we're placing this notice prominently by the entrance." Harrington accepted the card with a single nod, acknowledgement without effusive forgiveness, recognition of corrective action without pretending the original offense hadn't occurred. "Appropriate response to new intelligence," he said simply. Parker hesitated, clearly wanting some more explicit acceptance of his apology, but Reeves intervened with the instinctive understanding of someone who recognized the military communication taking place. "That's good policy," he said to Parker, offering the civilian translation Harrington had deliberately withheld. "Shows responsiveness to community standards." The interaction concluded with Parker retreating to the register, where Margaret gave him an approving nod that suggested she had played some role in his education process. Reeves and Tyler said their goodbyes, the father with a firm handshake and subtle nod that communicated respect between equals, the son with an enthusiastic wave and promised to see Ajax again soon. As they departed, Harrington noted how the dynamics in the diner had subtly shifted during their meal, the initial tension giving way to a new equilibrium where Ajax's presence was no longer the central focus, but simply one element in the community fabric. Customers who had watched their entrance with wary curiosity now continued their meals with the comfortable indifference that signaled acceptance. Captain Reed approached again as Harrington finished his coffee, sliding into the booth with the casual confidence of someone who knew their presence was welcome. "Mission parameters achieved, I'd say," he commented, glancing toward Parker, who was now engaged in animated conversation with Chief Grayson near the register. "Preliminary objectives secured," Harrington agreed. "Long-term stabilization requires consistent presence." Reed nodded, understanding the military assessment being applied to civilian territory. My team rotates out tomorrow, headed back to Fort Campbell, but the local VFW contingent seems to have operational capacity for continued reinforcement. Community integration requires multiple contact points, Harrington confirmed, referring to the network of veteran support he had quietly established throughout Riverdale. The Thursday evening group meetings, the school outreach program, the coordination with veteran-friendly employers like Sam Wilson's construction company. That new guy, Reeves, recent transition? Reed asked, the question carrying layers of professional assessment. Approximately 9 months post-discharge, limited integration progress, significant potential with appropriate support structure. Reed processed this information with the efficiency of a team leader evaluating unit capabilities. We're establishing a regional network, connecting isolated veterans in smaller communities with resources and peer support. Riverdale could be a node in that system. The proposition wasn't just about Reeves or even the current veteran population in Riverdale. It represented strategic thinking about long-term objectives, creating sustainable infrastructure for returning warriors that extended beyond individual success stories to systemic support. Coordinate through standard channels, Harrington replied, indicating his willingness to serve as the local connection point. Operational capacity exists for expanded parameters. Their conversation concluded with the efficient handshakes of men accustomed to making and confirming commitments without unnecessary elaboration. Reed rejoined his team, and within minutes they departed as they had arrived, in disciplined formation, their presence having accomplished its objective without requiring explicit action. As Harrington prepared to leave, Margaret brought the check, zeroed out with "Thank you for your service" written across it in Parker's handwriting. The gesture was symbolic rather than substantive, but symbols carried their own significance in community dynamics. "He's trying," Margaret said quietly, as Harrington examined the check. Not everyone adapts to new information at the same rate. Adaptation is measured by changed behavior, not initial response time, Harrington replied, leaving a $20 bill on the table despite the comped meal. A demonstration that principles rather than economics had driven his return to the diner. As he and Ajax moved toward the exit, Harrington noted the subtle nods of acknowledgement from various patrons. Some veterans he recognized, others civilians who had witnessed the resolution of yesterday's conflict. The atmosphere had transformed from the tense anticipation of their arrival to the comfortable recognition that order had been restored, not through confrontation, but through community reinforcement of shared values. Outside, the spring sunshine illuminated Main Street with the same brightness as yesterday, but the landscape had shifted in ways invisible to casual observation. Boundaries had been tested and reaffirmed, values had been clarified through action rather than declaration, and connections had formed where isolation had previously prevailed. Harrington paused on the sidewalk, surveying the town center with the habitual situational assessment ingrained through multiple combat deployments. But today, his tactical evaluation registered different metrics, not potential threats, but points of connection. Not defensive positions, but integration opportunities. Not exit strategies, but engagement possibilities. As they walked toward the truck, Harrington's phone vibrated with an incoming message, a text from Sam Wilson with a job site address and the note, "Reeves looking for work. Carpentry background. Worth interviewing. The Veterans Network already activating to incorporate the newly identified member into its support structure." "Next objective confirmed," Harrington said to Ajax as they reached the vehicle, the dog's attentive gaze fixed on his handler's face. "Expanded operational parameters for Thursday protocol." The simple acknowledgement contained layers of meaning that extended beyond their immediate situation. recognition that their mission in Riverdale had evolved from individual reintegration to community transformation, from maintaining personal boundaries to establishing sustainable infrastructure for others following similar paths, from combat zones to civilian life. As they drove away from the Sunrise Diner, Harrington observed the VFW members emerging to their cars, the police chief continuing his conversation with Parker near the entrance, Margaret waving from the window as she cleared their table. The tableau represented not just the resolution of a single conflict, but the reaffirmation of a community's capacity to recognize, protect, and incorporate the warriors who had served it, including those with 4 legs and unquestioning loyalty. The true stakes of their stand had never been about a meal in a diner or even the legal rights of a service animal. They had been about the fundamental question facing every community that receives returning warriors, whether those who had stood on the wall would find recognition, purpose, and belonging when they returned to the society they had protected. In Riverdale, at least for today, that question had been answered with unmistakable clarity. Not through speeches or ceremonies, but through the simple, powerful act of community members choosing to stand alongside those who had once stood for them. The evening shadows lengthened across Harrington's property as he sat on the back porch, watching Ajax patrol the perimeter with the methodical precision that years of training had ingrained. The day's events at the Sunrise Diner represented more than a simple resolution of conflict. They marked another milestone in the ongoing mission of reintegration that had begun 3 years earlier when he and Ajax had returned to Riverdale, not as conquering heroes, but as warriors struggling to translate combat skills into civilian functionality. The porch offered a vantage point that satisfied Harrington's tactical requirements: clear sightlines to approaching vehicles, multiple exit routes, and the reassuring solidity of the house at his back. These considerations weren't conscious choices anymore, but automatic assessments, as natural to him as breathing after 15 years of military service in environments where situational awareness meant survival. The soft crunch of tires on gravel announced a visitor, the second unexpected one that day. Ajax alerted with subtle attentiveness rather than alarm, indicating a known entity approaching. Minutes later, Dr. Eliza Carter's Jeep appeared around the bend in the driveway, unusual at this hour, but not unwelcome. "Evening house calls aren't standard protocol, Doctor," Harrington commented as she climbed the porch steps, medical bag in hand. "Thought I'd check Ajax's response to the new medication regimen," she replied, though they both recognized the professional justification as convenient cover for a more personal visit. "Heard there was quite a gathering at the diner today. News travels efficiently in Riverdale, especially when it involves 5 Special Forces operators, the police chief, and half the VFW membership converging on the same location." She settled into the adjacent Adirondack chair, her posture relaxed, but her eyes professionally assessing both Ajax and Harrington with the habitual thoroughness of someone trained to look for symptoms beyond the immediately obvious. "May I?" she asked, indicating Ajax, who had returned to the porch upon recognizing her. At Harrington's subtle hand signal, Ajax approached and allowed Dr. Carter to examine him, checking his gait, palpating his hip joint, and observing his responses to basic commands. The examination was largely ceremonial. Both knew the real purpose of her visit extended beyond veterinary concerns. "His mobility looks good, especially considering the stress of today's situation," she concluded, rewarding Ajax with a treat. From her pocket, a liberty granted to very few people in the dog's life. "How about his handler? Any flare-ups from the increased tension?" The question bridged professional assessment and personal concern in a way that acknowledged the inextricable connection between Ajax's well-being and Harrington's. For a military working dog paired with a handler experiencing post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury, the health of one directly affected the functionality of the other. Operational capacity maintained within acceptable parameters, Harrington replied, the formal phrasing neither confirming nor denying the physiological responses he had managed throughout the day. The elevated heart rate during the initial entry to the diner, the hypervigilance that had required conscious modulation, the sensory processing challenges in the crowded, noisy environment that Ajax's pressure against his leg had helped regulate. Dr. Carter's slight smile acknowledged the characteristic response. In the 3 years she had provided veterinary care for Ajax, and by extension, observed Harrington's reintegration progress, she had become adept at translating his military terminology into the emotional and physiological realities beneath. "I saw David Reeves at the office this afternoon," she said, shifting the conversation. "He brought in his son's hamster for a wellness check. Not exactly my specialty, but I suspect the animal was just a pretext." Harrington nodded, understanding the significance. For a combat veteran struggling with reintegration, initiating contact with a fellow veteran, even under the guise of a minor veterinary concern, represented a substantial step toward connection. "He mentioned meeting you at the diner," Dr. Carter continued. "Said Ajax seemed to recognize something in him that most people miss. Combat veterans share physiological markers regardless of specific deployment experiences," Harrington confirmed. "Ajax is trained to detect those indicators." "Yes, but there's more to it than training, isn't there?" Dr. Carter's question carried genuine curiosity rather than challenge. Something about shared experience that transcends clinical indicators. Harrington considered this, his gaze following Ajax as the dog resumed his evening patrol of my property boundary. In Afghanistan, unit cohesion depended on recognition, identifying those who understood the environment, the threats, the protocols. That recognition doesn't disappear after discharge. The simple explanation contained layers of meaning that extended beyond words. How combat created a particular frequency of awareness that other veterans could detect. How the hypervigilance that became maladaptive in civilian contexts remained. A point of connection between those who had developed it in war zones. "Reeves is 9 months post-discharge," Dr. Carter noted. "That's often when the real challenges of reintegration intensify. The initial relief of homecoming has faded, but civilian patterns haven't fully established." "Recognized parameters," Harrington agreed. 9 to 18 months post-deployment represents highest vulnerability period for isolation-related deterioration. His clinical assessment came from personal experience as much as statistical knowledge. His own reintegration timeline had followed a similar pattern, the initial homecoming marked by physical recovery and adjustment to basic civilian functions, followed by a darker period when the gap between military identity and civilian existence had seemed unbridgeable. Dr. Carter studied him with the careful attention she typically reserved for animals displaying subtle symptoms. "You know, sometimes I forget that 3 years ago you were where Reeves is now. The transformation has been remarkable, even from my limited vantage point." Harrington didn't respond immediately, unaccustomed to direct acknowledgement of his reintegration progress. In military operations, success was measured by mission completion and casualty prevention, objective metrics that didn't translate easily to the subjective territory of civilian functionality. "Different operational environment requires adaptive strategies," he said finally, the understated response characteristic of his communication style. "Reeves has advantageous factors. A son providing connection points, transferable vocational skills, identifiable support structure, higher probability of successful transition with appropriate resource allocation." Dr. Carter smiled at his analysis. recognizing the compassion beneath the tactical assessment. "You've become quite the strategic planner for veteran reintegration, Master Sergeant, far beyond your own mission parameters." Her observation touched on something Harrington rarely articulated even to himself, how his original focus on personal recovery had gradually expanded to encompass community-level initiatives. The school visits with Ajax, the Thursday evening, veteran meetings, the coordination with employers like Sam Wilson, the quiet advocacy with local businesses, all elements of a comprehensive approach to creating spaces where military experience could translate into civilian value. Individual recovery without community integration creates isolated success cases rather than sustainable infrastructure, he replied, the principle emerging from years of observation rather than formal training. Military operations depend on secure supply lines and forward operating bases. Civilian reintegration requires similar structural support. Their conversation paused as Ajax alerted to headlights approaching on the main road, then relaxed as the vehicle continued past the property entrance. This constant environmental assessment, performed in synchronized partnership between handler and dog, represented both the lingering hypervigilance of combat deployment and the adapted skill set that now served protective rather than offensive functions. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Dr. Carter said after the moment passed. "The photograph in your wallet, Ajax with you on a stretcher, Kandahar province, I believe you mentioned once. That was the incident that led to your medical retirement?" The question approached territory Harrington rarely discussed, not from secrecy, but from the difficulty of translating combat experience into language civilians could comprehend. Dr. Carter occupied an unusual position in this regard, not military herself, but someone whose deployment experience as a veterinarian attached to combat units had given her direct understanding of operational realities. April 17th, 2019, Harrington confirmed, the date embedded in his memory with the precision that trauma sometimes etched into neural pathways. Route clearance operation near Kandahar city. Ajax identified an IED approximately 20 meters ahead of our position. He paused, the chronology of those moments still accessible in perfect detail despite the traumatic brain injury that had affected other aspects of his memory. Standard protocol was initiated for controlled detonation. Secondary device activated during the procedure. 3 casualties, including our team's demolition specialist. Dr. Carter listened without interruption, recognizing that this clinical recitation represented Harrington's most comfortable approach to describing events that defied ordinary language. The absence of emotional descriptors didn't indicate lack of feeling, but rather the disciplined containment necessary for functional processing of combat experiences. Ajax had been trained to maintain position during controlled detonations. Harrington continued, his gaze fixed on the middle distance as if reviewing the incident in real time. When the secondary device activated, he violated protocol, returned to the blast zone despite continuing danger, located me semi-conscious, approximately 15 meters from original position, implemented extraction protocol despite sustaining shrapnel wounds to left hip and shoulder. The technical language created necessary distance from the visceral reality, how Ajax had dragged him from smoke and debris, how the dog had positioned himself between Harrington and potential threats despite his own injuries, how he had remained on guard during the 43 minutes required for medevac helicopters to reach their position. His actions contradicted certain aspects of his training, Harrington concluded, the apparent criticism belied by the undercurrent of profound respect in his voice. Protocol dictated maintaining perimeter security rather than casualty extraction. His operational decision represented adaptive problem-solving under exceptional circumstances. Dr. Carter nodded, understanding that in Harrington's framework this constituted the highest possible praise. Acknowledgement that the dog had transcended his training to make an independent assessment that prioritized his handler's survival over standard procedures. Exceptional circumstances often reveal character beyond training, she observed, both in dogs and their handlers. The conversation paused as Ajax completed another perimeter check and returned to the porch, settling at Harrington's feet with the watchful relaxation of a guard who had verified boundary security. The evening had deepened around them, crickets providing ambient sound that helped mask the transition from day to night, always a period of heightened alertness for those whose combat deployments had included enemy movement under cover of darkness. "The school visit today," Dr. Carter said, changing the subject with the intuitive sensitivity of someone who recognized when a topic had reached its natural conclusion. Tyler Reeves mentioned it when his father brought in the hamster. Said, "You introduced him as your assistant handler in training." Harrington nodded. "The boy demonstrates natural aptitude for working with Ajax, follows instructions precisely, maintains appropriate boundaries, shows instinctive understanding of command structure. Valuable characteristics for the protocol we're establishing, and provides him with structured connection to a stable male figure who understands his father's experiences," Dr. Carter added, completing the unspoken dimension of the arrangement. "That's quite a comprehensive intervention, Master Sergeant." "Tactical approach to strategic objective," Harrington replied simply. "Family stability directly impacts veteran reintegration success rates. Supporting the son creates secondary benefits for the father." This characteristically understated explanation masked the deeper motivations that had prompted Harrington's response to Tyler Reeves. Recognition of a child adapting to a parent's invisible wounds, developing hypervigilance not in combat zones, but in his own home, navigating the unpredictable terrain of a father struggling to translate wartime identity into peacetime functionality. Dr. Carter seemed about to respond when her phone chimed with an incoming message. She checked it quickly, her expression shifting to professional focus. "Emergency at the clinic. Carter family's retriever got into some rat poison. I need to go." She rose, gathering her bag with practiced efficiency. "We'll reschedule Ajax's follow-up for next week." As she descended the porch steps, she paused and turned back. "You know, when you first returned to Riverdale, some people questioned whether you'd be able to adapt to civilian life, given the extent of your injuries and experiences. I don't think anyone anticipated you would become the cornerstone of the veteran community here." Before Harrington could respond to this unexpected observation, she continued, "That's the thing about true warriors, isn't it? They fight not just for themselves, but for those who follow behind them. The battles just take different forms." With that, she departed, her headlights illuminating the driveway briefly before disappearing around the bend. Harrington remained. On the porch, Dr. Carter's words lingering in the evening air, an articulation of something he rarely considered in such explicit terms. His military career had been defined by clear mission parameters, quantifiable objectives, and established protocols. The path that had unfolded since his medical retirement followed no such defined structure. It had emerged organically from necessity, from the recognition that survival required more than physical recovery, from the gradual discovery that the skills developed for combat could be translated to different types of terrain. As full darkness settled over the property, Harrington performed a final exterior check before leading Ajax inside for the evening routine, securing doors and windows, preparing Ajax's evening medication, reviewing the next day's objectives. The protocols provided structure that bridged military precision and civilian functionality, maintaining operational readiness within a context that no longer demanded combat effectiveness. In the study that served as Harrington's home office, a wall-mounted corkboard displayed maps of Riverdale and surrounding communities, with coloured pins indicating veteran residences, support resources, and integration points. What had begun as a personal orientation tool had evolved into a strategic planning aid as Harrington's individual reintegration expanded to encompass community-level initiatives. A red pin had been added that morning to mark the Reeves residence, another data point in the emerging network, another potential node in the infrastructure being quietly constructed throughout Riverdale. Beside it, Harrington now placed a green pin indicating vocational opportunity, Sam Wilson's construction site, where Reeves would interview the following day. The mapping exercise wasn't just practical planning, but a form of mission visualization, identifying objectives, resources, and potential obstacles in terrain that offered no topographical features to navigate by. In the absence of military structure, Harrington had created his own operational framework, adapting combat planning methodologies to the equally challenging landscape of civilian reintegration. As he completed the evening security check, Harrington's phone rang, an unusual occurrence at 2200 hours. The caller ID displayed Reynolds D. Officer Dave Reynolds, calling outside normal hours, suggested a situation requiring attention. Harrington, he answered, the abbreviated greeting a holdover from military communications protocol. Jim, sorry to call so late, Reynolds began, his tone professionally controlled, but with an underlying urgency. We've got a situation at Lawson's bar on Route 16. David Reeves is there, apparently having some kind of episode. Owner called it in as a disturbance, but from the description, it sounds like a PTSD trigger event. Harrington processed this information with the rapid assessment that had once helped him evaluate battlefield developments. Current status? I've got the scene contained for now. Cleared the immediate area, trying to de-escalate. But he's not responding well to uniform presence. Might be triggering combat associations. Thought you might have better luck establishing communication. Affirmative. Estimated arrival time, 12 minutes. Harrington was already moving toward the door, Ajax alert and ready beside him. Maintain perimeter security, but minimize visible law enforcement presence. No lights, no sirens, no additional units unless absolutely necessary. Understood. I'll keep things quiet until you get here. The call ended with the efficient brevity that characterized communications between professionals in crisis situations. Harrington grabbed Ajax's service vest and his own jacket, checking that the dog's identification tags, both the military ones and the new one from Sam Wilson, were properly secured. This wasn't a planned operation, but the protocols remained the same. Equipment check, environmental assessment, objective clarification. Within 3 minutes they were in the truck and moving down the driveway, headlights illuminating the narrow road that connected Harrington's property to the main highway. The digital clock on the dashboard read 10:07 p.m., an unusual hour for Harrington to be away from his secured perimeter, but operational necessities overrode personal protocols. As they drove toward Lawson's bar, Harrington's mind processed available intelligence and formulated response options with the methodical thoroughness ingrained through years of mission planning. Reeves was approximately 9 months post-discharge, a vulnerable period when hypervigilance often remained high while coping mechanisms were still developing. The bar environment presented multiple potential triggers: crowded spaces, loud noises, unfamiliar personnel, possibly alcohol affecting response inhibition. The situation represented more than an individual veteran in distress. It was a test case for the community integration infrastructure Harrington had been quietly building. How Riverdale responded to a combat veteran experiencing post-traumatic symptoms in public would indicate whether the groundwork laid over the past 3 years had created genuine understanding or merely superficial accommodation. Lawson's bar appeared ahead, a standalone structure on the outskirts of town that served a clientele ranging from local factory workers to long-haul truckers passing through. The gravel parking lot contained fewer vehicles than usual for a Thursday night, suggesting Reynolds had implemented crowd reduction protocols after arriving. A patrol car was visible, but positioned discreetly at the edge of the property, emergency lights inactive as requested. Harrington parked near the entrance, but left sufficient maneuvering room for rapid departure if necessary, a habit developed in environments where extraction routes could determine survival. Before exiting the vehicle, he turned to Ajax, establishing the clear eye contact that preceded important commands. "Specialized protocol," he said, using the designation they had developed for situations involving veterans in distress. "Perimeter maintenance, no engagement without direct command, alert. Behavior indicators only." Ajax's focused attention confirmed the instructions were received. The dog understood this was not a standard public interaction, but a modified protocol requiring particular restraint and awareness. Their training together had expanded beyond Ajax's original military working dog parameters to encompass therapeutic support functions, creating a hybrid skill set uniquely adapted to civilian veteran support operations. Reynolds emerged from the bar entrance as they approached, his uniform deliberately covered by an unzipped jacket that minimized official appearance while maintaining necessary equipment access. The officer's expression combined professional control and personal concern, the balance struck by those whose duty intersected with community connection. "He's at a corner table," Reynolds reported quietly, falling into the mission briefing format without conscious transition. "Owner says he came in about an hour ago, ordered one beer, seemed fine until a group at the pool table got rowdy. Something triggered a reaction, possibly the sound of breaking glass or just the sudden increase in volume. He moved to a defensive position in the corner, refused to communicate, exhibited hypervigilance consistent with combat response patterns." Harrington nodded, absorbing the information while scanning the exterior and entrance for additional factors, exit routes, potential hazards, environmental conditions that might exacerbate or mitigate the situation. "Current containment status? A bar cleared except for owner behind counter and Reeves in corner. All potential weapons secured. Owner cooperative, understanding the situation." Reynolds hesitated briefly before adding, "Called his son's mother, but she's working night. Shift at the hospital. Can't leave for at least 3 hours." This additional detail provided important context. Reeves was experiencing this episode without immediate family support, potentially increasing vulnerability and decreasing natural de-escalation options. The absence of his son removed an emotional anchor that might otherwise help ground him during dissociative states. "I'll make initial contact," Harrington decided. "Ajax follows at 4-meter distance until directed otherwise. Maintain your position outside unless requested." Reynolds nodded, accepting the operational plan without question, a recognition that in this specific scenario, Harrington's expertise superseded official authority. "If you need backup or medical response, one word to the owner, and I'm in." Paramedics on standby 2 blocks away, no lights or sirens, prepared for PTSD protocol. The coordination reflected the community preparation that had gradually developed in Riverdale over the past 3 years. Emergency responders trained to modify standard approaches when dealing with combat veterans, law enforcement officers, educated on de-escalation techniques specific to post-traumatic stress responses, business owners briefed on recognition and appropriate reactions to dissociative episodes. With Ajax positioned at the designated distance, Harrington entered Lawson's bar, immediately conducting the environmental assessment that had once been standard procedure for entering any structure in combat zones. The interior was dimly lit, the usual Thursday night crowd noticeably absent. Behind the counter, owner Mike Lawson, a Vietnam-era Navy veteran himself, stood with the controlled alertness of someone who recognized the seriousness of the situation without panic. At the far corner table, David Reeves sat with his back to the wall, his posture rigid with hypervigilance, his eyes continuously scanning the room with the focused intensity of someone perceiving active threats rather than empty tables. His right hand remained below the table edge, possibly concealing a weapon, more likely positioned for rapid response to perceived danger. Harrington approached with measured steps, maintaining clear visibility and deliberate movements that avoided triggering startle responses. His path created an angle that kept him in Reeves's direct line of sight, while preserving sufficient distance for safety. Protocols developed for encountering potentially hostile civilians in combat zones now applied to a fellow veteran experiencing dissociation in a hometown bar. Staff Sergeant Reeves, Harrington began, using military address deliberately to establish connection through familiar protocol. Master Sergeant Harrington, 5th Special Forces Group. Area secure, perimeter established, threat level minimal. The military terminology wasn't random, but specifically chosen to access training patterns that often remained intact even during dissociative episodes. Combat veterans typically retained response capabilities to chain-of-command communications, even when civilian interaction protocols broke down under stress. Reeves's eyes focused on Harrington, recognition flickering through the hypervigilant scanning. "Master Sergeant," he acknowledged, his voice tense but controlled. "Situation report unclear. Environmental parameters compromised. Possible hostile. Presence detected." The response confirmed Harrington's assessment. Reeves was experiencing a dissociative episode that merged present environment with combat zone perceptions, but retained sufficient functional capacity for verbal communication and protocol recognition. This represented an intermediate state rather than full traumatic flashback, offering multiple intervention options. "Conducting joint assessment," Harrington replied, maintaining the military framework while slowly closing distance. "Request. Permission to approach your position for situation clarification." This deliberate request for permission, rather than directive approach, served multiple functions, reinforcing Reeves's agency during a state where control often felt compromised, establishing cooperative rather than authoritarian interaction, and providing observable evidence of respect rather than threat. Reeves hesitated, conflict evident in his expression, as present reality and combat perception competed for dominance in his processing. After several seconds, he nodded sharply. Permission granted, but with clear reservations. Harrington moved to the table with the measured precision that had once characterized his movement through potentially mined terrain, each step deliberate and visible. When he reached speaking distance, he maintained a balanced stance that communicated readiness without aggression. "Staff Sergeant, I'm accompanied by a military working dog with medical response training," he said, gesturing toward Ajax, who remained at the designated position near the entrance. "Request authorization to incorporate canine support for situation assessment." The introduction of Ajax provided multiple tactical advantages, offering a focal point for Reeves' hypervigilance that represented ally rather than threat. Providing the calming presence that trained service animals often facilitated during post-traumatic episodes, and creating a bridge between combat experience and present reality through the familiar protocol of military working dog operations. "Dogs cleared for approach," Reeves responded, his military terminology remaining intact despite the civilian setting. "Maintain visual confirmation of all entry points." Harrington signaled Ajax forward with a subtle hand gesture. The dog, moving with the disciplined control that distinguished military working dogs from pets. He approached without direct engagement, positioning himself at the tactically optimal location that offered Reeves clear sightlines to his presence without invading personal space. A careful balance of proximity and distance developed through specialized training for veteran support situations. The effect was almost immediate. Reeves's rigid posture softened fractionally, his breathing pattern showing subtle regulation as Ajax's presence activated associations with secure operational environments rather than threat scenarios. The dog represented a known quantity in uncertain territory, a reliable element in a situation where perception had become compromised. Conducting environmental assessment, Harrington continued, gradually transitioning from pure military protocol toward a blend that incorporated civilian reality. Location is Lawson's Bar, Riverdale Township. Current time 22:27 hours. Present personnel include owner Mike Lawson, former Navy corpsman Vietnam era, Officer Dave Reynolds maintaining exterior security non-engagement protocol. This methodical orientation provided concrete data points that helped anchor Reeves in present reality without directly challenging his perceptual experience. A technique developed from both military psychological operations and therapeutic approaches to post-traumatic dissociation. Recognized parameters, Reeves acknowledged, his eyes still scanning but with decreasing intensity. Sensory input inconsistent with location designation. Auditory triggers activated defensive protocols. The description offered valuable diagnostic information, confirmation that auditory stimuli had triggered the episode, suggesting specific sensory processing challenges rather than generalized environmental stress. Harrington nodded, acknowledging the report without questioning its validity. Sensory inconsistencies noted and confirmed, he replied, validating Reeves's experience while gradually introducing alternative interpretation. Possible explanations include temporal displacement, effect or environmental echo patterns. Ajax is trained to distinguish between actual and perceived threats. This framing offered a bridge between combat hypervigilance and civilian reality, not dismissing the sensory experience, but providing explanatory frameworks that allowed for both the validity of the perception and the safety of the current environment. Ajax's calm presence served as visible evidence supporting the assessment of minimal actual threat. Gradually, Harrington established conversational rhythm that blended military protocol with civilian context, creating a communication pathway that neither fully endorsed the dissociative perception nor bluntly contradicted it. Throughout this process, Ajax maintained his positioned vigilance, his disciplined presence serving as both reassurance and reality anchor. After approximately 20 minutes of this calibrated interaction, Reeves's physiological indicators showed significant improvement. Breathing patterns normalized, muscle tension reduced, scanning behavior decreased in frequency and intensity. The dissociative episode was receding, allowing greater access to present moment awareness. Situation assessment updated, Reeves said finally, his voice steadier though fatigue now evident in its edges. Perceptual displacement confirmed. Location. Parameters accepted. The acknowledgement represented crucial progress, recognition of the dissociative nature of the experience without shame or denial, acceptance of current reality without abandoning the validity of the reaction. Harrington nodded, maintaining the matter-of-fact tone that had characterized their interaction. Standard protocol following perceptual recalibration includes secure transport to designated recovery location, he said, offering structured next steps rather than open-ended uncertainty. Options include medical evaluation at Riverdale Memorial or return to primary residence with appropriate support personnel. This presentation of choices restored agency while maintaining necessary structure, a balance particularly important following dissociative episodes when decision-making capacity might be compromised, but autonomy needed reinforcement. Reeves considered the options with the focused assessment of someone emerging from combat alertness into strategic planning. Medical evaluation unnecessary, return to primary residence preferred. Son's mother on hospital rotation until 0600. The concern for his son emerged naturally in this statement, parental responsibility reasserting itself as combat associations receded, family connections re-establishing priority over threat response. Harrington acknowledged this with a confirming nod. Secure transport available through non-official channels, he offered. Ajax and I can provide escort to your residence and maintain perimeter security until relieved by family member or designated personnel. The offer represented more than practical assistance. It acknowledged the vulnerability that often followed. Dissociative episodes without requiring verbal admission of need. Structured support framed as tactical operation preserved dignity while providing necessary monitoring during the transition period when recurrence risk remained elevated. Reeves accepted with a sharp nod, military brevity requiring no further elaboration. With the intervention phase complete, Harrington implemented extraction protocol, coordinating with Reynolds for discreet departure, ensuring Lawson understood the situation had been resolved without incident, establishing clear movement parameters with Ajax, providing perimeter security throughout the transition from building to vehicle. As they drove toward Reeves's residence on the north side of Riverdale, the conversation maintained the balanced protocol that had proven effective, neither ignoring the episode nor focusing exclusively on it, neither minimizing its significance nor catastrophizing its implications. Instead, Harrington created space for practical planning and forward orientation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.